The coin rolled across the wet pavement and came to rest against her worn sneaker like fate had just tapped her on the shoulder. It was barely worth bending down for, just a few pennies scattered near the bus stop. But 17-year-old Maya Chen watched them glitter under the streetlight like they were trying to tell her something. The November wind cut through her thin jacket as she knelt to gather them up, not because she was desperate, though she was, but because her grandmother had taught her that money disrespected is luck abandoned. She didn't notice the man watching from across the street, his expensive camera hidden beneath a threadbare coat, documenting everything. To anyone passing by, he looked like just another person waiting for the last bus, shoulders hunched against the cold, face obscured by a hood pulled low. But Richard Ashford was many things, and invisible was only his most recent disguise. The 72-year-old founder of Ashford Industries had spent the last 3 weeks living a lie, and tonight, in this forgotten corner of the city, he was about to discover a truth that would unravel everything he thought he knew about the people in his life. Maya counted the pennies carefully, 8 in total, then looked around as if someone might claim them. When no one did, she slipped them into her pocket alongside the crumpled bills and loose change that represented her entire savings, $14.33 now. Enough for 3 days of bus fare to her 2 jobs, or groceries for her and her grandmother, but never both. She had learned to choose carefully. What Maya didn't know, couldn't possibly know, was that those 8 pennies had been placed there deliberately. They were part of an experiment that had already broken Richard Ashford's heart a dozen times over. For 3 weeks, he had been dropping small amounts of money in public places, pennies, nickels, crumpled singles, then watching to see who stopped and what they did next. The results had been devastating. In wealthy neighborhoods, people stepped over money as if it were trash. In business districts, men in $1,000 suits ignored coins at their feet. He had watched teenagers kick pennies into gutters, watched couples laugh at the idea of bending down for loose change. But it was the ones who did stop that truly shattered him. A well-dressed woman who pocketed a dropped wallet without looking back. A young man who found a $20 bill and immediately used it to buy cigarettes, stepping over a homeless veteran on his way into the store. A teenager who gathered scattered coins, then used them to buy lottery tickets while her younger sibling waited hungry in their car. Each observation confirmed what Richard had begun to suspect, that somewhere along the way, society had traded decency for convenience, compassion for comfort. And his own family, he was learning, had led that trade. The experiment had started with a phone call that changed everything. 3 months earlier, Richard's doctor had used words like aggressive and inoperable in months, not years. The cancer had been quiet, efficient, ruthless. By the time they found it, there was nothing to do but count down. Richard had built an empire over 5 decades, survived recessions and hostile takeovers, turned a small manufacturing company into a multinational corporation worth $8 billion. But he couldn't survive his own cells turning traitor. When he told his family, their reactions taught him more than 50 years of business ever had. His son, Trevor, had immediately started talking about transition plans and board restructuring. His daughter, Cassandra, had asked about estate taxes and whether the offshore accounts were properly shielded. His ex-wife, Margaret, had called her lawyer before calling him back. Not one of them had asked how he felt. Not one had offered to simply sit with him. In that moment, surrounded by people who shared his blood and his name, Richard Ashford had never felt more alone. That night, unable to sleep, he had made a decision that his lawyers would later call reckless and his family would call insane. If his own children couldn't show basic human decency, he would find someone who could. And he would test them the only way that mattered, by stripping away every advantage and seeing who still chose kindness when there was nothing to gain. The experiment began simply. Richard started visiting places he had never been, soup kitchens, public libraries, bus stations, dressed in clothes bought from thrift stores, his face hidden behind weeks of deliberately unkempt beard growth. He carried no identification, no credit cards, nothing that could reveal who he really was, just enough cash to survive and a small camera to document what he found. The first week nearly destroyed him. At a community center, he had fumbled with change at a vending machine, clearly struggling. Dozens of people walked past, not one stopped to help. At a public library, he had asked for assistance finding a book on job applications. The librarian had pointed vaguely toward a computer, then returned to her phone. Outside a grocery store, he had dropped a bag of apples. They rolled across the parking lot while shoppers stepped around them, annoyed by the obstacle. By day 10, Richard had begun to lose faith not just in people, but in the entire premise of his experiment. Perhaps kindness was dead. Perhaps he had been naive to think it still existed outside of transactions and expectations. Perhaps his children were simply products of the world he had helped create, where everything had a price and nothing had value. Then came the pennies. It was a last attempt, almost desperate. People wouldn't help a struggling stranger. Would they at least respect something as small as lost money? Would anyone treat even pennies as if they mattered? Richard had been dropping coins and watching for 2 days when Maya Chen knelt on that cold pavement. And what happened next, in the span of less than 5 minutes, would change both of their lives forever. After pocketing the pennies, Maya stood and adjusted her backpack. She was about to walk toward the bus stop when she noticed something that made her pause. An elderly woman, probably in her 80s, was trying to navigate the curb with a wheeled shopping cart that had gotten stuck. The woman pulled weakly, her thin frame no match for the stubborn wheel caught in a crack in the pavement. Maya glanced at the approaching bus, still 2 blocks away but moving steadily closer. She had exactly 1 bus pass left for the week. If she missed this one, she would have to walk the 4 miles to her night shift at the convenience store, which meant arriving late, which meant risking the job she desperately needed. The choice took less than a second. Maya hurried over to the elderly woman and lifted the cart free with a quick, practiced motion. The woman's face brightened with relief and surprise. Richard watched through his camera as the two exchanged words he couldn't hear. He watched Maya gesture to the bus stop, then shake her head at something the woman said. He watched the bus approach, slow, then stop. And then he watched something that made his throat tighten. Maya helped the elderly woman onto the bus first, supporting her elbow, carrying her cart. But when the woman was safely seated, Maya stepped back down onto the pavement. The bus driver said something, probably asking if she was coming. Maya shook her head, smiled, and waved them on. She had given up her last bus pass. Richard watched the girl, this teenager he had never met, stand in the cold and watch the bus disappear into the night. Then she pulled out her phone, checked something, put it away, and started walking. She didn't look angry or resentful. She simply walked, her pace steady and purposeful, as if this was just what people did, as if kindness didn't require an audience or a reward. Richard felt something crack inside his chest, and for a moment he thought it might be his heart giving out entirely. But it wasn't death. It was something far more painful and far more powerful. It was hope. He followed her at a distance, this girl who had chosen compassion over convenience. He watched her walk 4 miles through neighborhoods that grew progressively rougher, her hand always on the pepper spray attached to her keychain, her eyes alert but not afraid. He watched her arrive at a convenience store with flickering lights and bars on the windows, watched her tie on an apron, and greet the night manager with a tired but genuine smile. And he watched her work for 6 straight hours, restocking shelves and cleaning floors and handling customers with a patience that seemed impossible for someone so young and so exhausted. When her shift ended at 3 in the morning, Richard watched her count her tips, $7.42, and carefully divide them into 2 envelopes she pulled from her bag. One was labeled Grandma's Medicine. The other said College Fund, though the amount inside couldn't have been more than a few $100s, saved penny by penny, shift by shift. That's when Richard Ashford made his decision. Not impulsively, though it might look that way to others, but with the clarity that comes from finally seeing what matters. This girl, this stranger who stopped for pennies and gave up bus rides, who worked through the night and saved for a future she had every reason to doubt, this was who deserved to carry forward what he had built. Not because she wanted it, but because she would use it the way it should have been used all along, to lift others up rather than to climb higher herself. The next morning, Richard returned to his real life, to the penthouse and the corner office and the tailored suits. He called his attorney and began the process that would soon tear his family apart and rebuild his legacy from the ground up. He knew what would follow: outrage, accusations, legal battles that would stretch for months. His children would call him senile. The media would call it a scandal. Psychologists would be hired to question his mental state. But none of it mattered anymore, because in a cold November night, watching a teenage girl choose kindness without witnesses, Richard had finally understood what wealth was actually for. 3 weeks later, the meeting took place in a conference room that smelled of leather and old money. Trevor Ashford sat at one end of the long table, his jaw tight with barely controlled rage. Cassandra sat across from him, her manicured nails drumming an impatient rhythm on the mahogany surface. Between them, Richard's attorney distributed folders with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before, though never under circumstances quite like these. Richard himself sat at the head of the table, thinner than he had been a month ago, his skin carrying the gray pallor of someone losing a war with their own body. But his eyes were clear, clearer than they had been in years, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Before we begin," he said quietly, "I want you both to know that I made this decision with full mental capacity, complete legal counsel, and more conviction than I've felt about anything in my entire life." Trevor leaned forward. "Dad, whatever this is, we can discuss it. There are options. We don't have to do anything drastic." Richard smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Open the folders." The sound of paper rustling filled the room like dry leaves before a storm. Then silence, absolute and suffocating, as Trevor and Cassandra read words that redrew the entire map of their futures. "To my son, Trevor," the document read, "I leave the sum of $500,000, the contents of my personal library, and my collection of vintage watches. I leave no shares in Ashford Industries, no seat on the board, and no control over any assets or properties held by the family trust." Cassandra's hands were shaking as she read her own section. "To my daughter, Cassandra, I leave the sum of $500,000, the art collection from the Connecticut estate, and the property in Martha's Vineyard. I leave no shares in Ashford Industries, no seat on the board, and no control over any assets or properties held by the family trust. The primary beneficiary," the document continued, "of all remaining assets, including 75% controlling interest in Ashford Industries, all associated properties, investments, and trusts, is Maya Chen, age 17, currently residing in the city." Trevor's folder hit the table with a sound like a gunshot. "This is insane. You're giving $8 billion to a stranger, a child." Richard met his son's eyes without flinching. "I'm giving it to someone who understands what it means to be human. Someone who makes choices based on character, not calculation." Cassandra's voice was ice. "We're your children. We've been here our entire lives." Where was she? Richard leaned back in his chair, and for a moment the pain showed on his face, not physical pain, but something deeper and older. "You've been here," he said softly, "but you've never seen me. Not really. When I told you I was dying, Trevor, you asked about quarterly projections. Cassandra, you asked about estate planning. Neither of you asked how I was feeling. Neither of you offered to sit with me. Neither of you cried." The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker. "But that's not even why," Richard continued. 3 weeks ago, I spent every day watching how people treat each other when there's nothing to gain. I watched you both too, though you didn't know it. Trevor, I watched you berate a parking attendant for 5 minutes because he couldn't find your car fast enough. Cassandra, I watched you refuse to give $1 to a veteran outside your building, then spend $300 on a handbag an hour later." He paused, letting the words settle like sediment in water. "Then I watched a 17-year-old girl stop to pick up pennies, not because she's greedy, but because she's been taught that everything has value. I watched her give up her last bus pass to help an elderly woman, then walk 4 miles in the cold to a job that pays minimum wage. I watched her split $7 in tips between her grandmother's medicine and her own impossible dream of college. That girl has more integrity in her exhaustion than either of you has ever shown in your privilege." Trevor stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You're not thinking clearly. The cancer, the medications, they're affecting your judgment. We'll fight this. We'll have you declared incompetent." Richard nodded slowly as if he had expected exactly this response. "You can try. I've been evaluated by 3 independent psychiatrists. I've documented everything. The will is airtight. And Trevor," he added, his voice dropping to something almost sad, "the fact that your first response is to attack my mental state rather than to question your own behavior tells me everything I need to know. I made the right choice." Cassandra was crying now, but they were angry tears, not sad ones. "How could you do this to us? We're your family." "Family," Richard repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. "Family is supposed to mean more than shared DNA. It's supposed to mean showing up, caring, seeing each other as human beings, not assets to inherit." He looked at both of them, these people he had raised and failed in equal measure. "I gave you every advantage, every opportunity, every comfort. And somehow, you learned everything except the one thing that actually matters. You learned how to take, but never how to give. You learned how to succeed, but never how to be kind. That's my failure as much as yours. But I won't compound it by giving you power over resources you'll only use to elevate yourselves." The meeting ended not with resolution, but with threats and slammed doors and promises of legal warfare. Richard sat alone in the conference room for a long time after they left, listening to the city hum beyond the windows. He felt tired, so tired that breathing seemed like work. But beneath the exhaustion was something he hadn't felt in years: peace. The kind that comes from finally choosing right over easy. Maya Chen learned about her new reality on a Tuesday afternoon, in the same convenience store where she had worked for 2 years. She was restocking candy bars when 2 people in expensive suits walked through the door, looking so out of place that her first thought was robbery. Instead, they asked for her by name. The conversation that followed felt like a dream, the kind where logic dissolves and impossible things are presented as fact. A billionaire, a will, $8 billion. They used words like trust and fiduciary responsibility and legal transition, but Maya heard none of it clearly because her ears were ringing and her hands had gone numb. "This is a mistake," she kept saying. "You have the wrong person. I don't know anyone named Richard Ashford, but they didn't have the wrong person." They had documents, photographs, a letter written in shaking handwriting that explained everything. Richard Ashford had watched her pick up pennies. He had watched her give up her bus pass. He had watched her choose kindness over convenience, humanity over comfort. And he had decided that those choices, made without audience or reward, revealed more about character than any resume or pedigree ever could. The letter ended with words that Maya would read 1,000 times in the years that followed. "You didn't know anyone was watching," Richard had written. "That's exactly why it mattered. Kindness performed for applause is just transaction. Kindness given freely at personal cost, when no one will ever know, that's character. And character is the only foundation worth building on. I'm giving you resources beyond imagination, not because you asked for them, but because I trust you to use them the way I should have all along. Don't let this money change who you are. Let it amplify what you've always been. Someone who stops for pennies because everything matters. Someone who gives up bus rides because everyone matters. The world will tell you that you don't deserve this. They'll call it scandal and question your worth. Don't listen. I've spent 50 years in boardrooms with people who think they deserve everything, and I've watched you for 3 weeks treating the world with a grace they'll never understand. You deserve this because you'll do what they never would. You'll remember where you came from and you'll reach back to lift others up. That's not just deserving, that's purpose." Maya's hands were shaking so badly that the letter fluttered like a captured bird. Around her, the convenience store continued its normal rhythm, customers buying lottery tickets and energy drinks, the register beeping its electronic song, the fluorescent lights humming their constant note. Everything was exactly the same, and nothing would ever be the same again. The legal battle started within 48 hours. Trevor and Cassandra Ashford filed emergency motions claiming undue influence, diminished capacity, fraud. They hired investigators to dig into Maya's past, looking for anything that could suggest manipulation or premeditation. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. Just a girl who worked 2 jobs, took care of her grandmother, saved pennies, and tried to be kind in a world that rarely rewarded kindness. The media descended like locusts. Billionaire leaves fortune to teenage stranger. Family outraged by shocking will. The girl who inherited $8 billion. Every detail of Maya's life was suddenly public property, dissected and analyzed and judged by millions of people who had never picked up pennies in the rain or given up bus passes for strangers. Some called her a gold digger, despite the fact that she had never met Richard Ashford, never knew he existed. Some called it a publicity stunt. Some called Richard insane. But some, a growing number, called it something else. A reminder, a test. A challenge to a world that had forgotten what actually matters. Through it all, Maya tried to stay grounded. She continued living with her grandmother in their small apartment, though lawyers insisted she needed security. She tried to keep working at the convenience store until the media attention became too disruptive. She enrolled in community college classes, even though she now had resources to attend any university in the world. Because Richard's letter had been right about one thing. The money couldn't change who she was. It could only reveal it. And Maya was determined to prove that kindness wasn't a strategy or a performance. It was simply who she had always been and who she would remain, even with 8 billion reasons to become someone else. The court hearing took place on a gray morning when winter was beginning to surrender to spring. The courtroom was packed with journalists, lawyers, and curious observers who wanted to witness what some were calling the trial of the decade. Trevor and Cassandra sat on one side, flanked by a legal team that looked like it cost more per hour than most people earned in a year. Maya sat on the other side, wearing a simple dress her grandmother had altered to fit properly, her hands folded in her lap, her face calm despite the storm raging around her. The Ashford legal team presented their case with precision and passion. They brought in psychiatrists who questioned whether Richard's judgment had been impaired by medication. They presented evidence of the speed with which the will had been changed, suggesting it indicated instability. They painted Maya as an opportunist who had somehow manipulated a dying man despite having no contact with him. It was a performance of desperation dressed up as concern. Then Maya's attorney stood and the room shifted. He didn't present psychiatric evaluations, though he had them. He didn't argue about legal precedent, though he could have. Instead, he played a video. The footage was grainy, shot from across a street on a cold November night. It showed a teenage girl kneeling to pick up scattered pennies. It showed her helping an elderly woman onto a bus. It showed her stepping back down, giving up her seat, her ride, her convenience. It showed her walking alone into the dark, choosing kindness over comfort without hesitation or audience. This, the attorney said quietly, is who Richard Ashford saw, not a manipulator, not an opportunist. A human being who made the choice to be decent when no one was watching and nothing was to be gained. He paused, letting the video speak louder than any argument. Richard Ashford spent 3 weeks testing the world, searching for proof that compassion still existed beyond transaction. His own children failed that test repeatedly, as documented in his personal journals. This young woman passed it without knowing she was being tested. That's not manipulation. That's character. The attorney then presented Richard's journals, pages and pages documenting the experiment, the disappointments, the observations of his own children's behavior, and finally, the moment he found what he was looking for. The entries were heartbreaking in their honesty. Richard had written about his fear that kindness was dead, that he had raised children who saw people as obstacles or opportunities but never as human beings. He had written about watching Maya with a mixture of disbelief and hope, as if she were proof that he hadn't been wrong to expect better from the world. The final entry, written just days before his death, was read aloud in a courtroom so quiet that breathing seemed intrusive. "I am at peace," Richard had written, "not because I'm ready to die, but because I finally found what I was looking for. Proof that humanity still exists in its purest form, not calculated or performed, but instinctive and true. Maya Chen will face challenges I cannot protect her from. She will be tested and questioned and doubted. But I have watched her choose kindness when it cost her everything and gained her nothing. That is a stronger foundation than any I could build with money. If my children contest this will, as I suspect they will, let this be my final testimony. I was of sound mind. I was fully informed. And I made this choice not out of spite, but out of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, the world can be rebuilt by people who remember that we're all human, that we all struggle, and that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is stop to help someone else, even when no one is watching. The judge took less than an hour to deliberate. When she returned, her face was unreadable, but her voice was firm. The will stands. Richard Ashford's wishes will be honored in full. The courtroom erupted. Trevor stormed out without looking back. Cassandra sat frozen, her face a mask of disbelief and rage. And Maya, 17-year-old Maya Chen, who had picked up pennies and given up bus rides and never imagined that kindness could be currency, sat very still and cried. Not because she had won, but because a stranger had seen her, truly seen her, and decided she was worthy of trust. In the months that followed, Maya did something that shocked everyone who had been watching. She didn't buy a mansion or a sports car. She didn't throw parties or take extravagant vacations. Instead, she established the Ashford Foundation, dedicated to supporting working families, funding education, and creating opportunities for people who had been invisible to the systems designed to help them. She hired people who had been overlooked, invested in neighborhoods that had been forgotten, and made decisions based not on profit margins but on human impact. She turned empty buildings into community centers. She funded scholarships for students who worked night shifts to pay for school. She created programs that paid people living wages to learn new skills, and every single decision was guided by a simple question: what would help the person I used to be? The business world called her naive. Analysts predicted the foundation would collapse within a year, but something unexpected happened. The foundation thrived, because Maya understood something that boardrooms had forgotten. When you invest in people, when you treat them with dignity and give them real opportunities, they don't just survive, they flourish. And that flourishing creates value that no spreadsheet can measure. She also did something else, something that would have made Richard smile. Every Tuesday evening, Maya volunteered at the same convenience store where she used to work. She stocked shelves alongside teenagers working their first jobs. She listened to their worries about rent and tuition and sick family members. And sometimes, when no one was looking, she would slip an envelope into someone's locker, just enough to cover the crisis they hadn't told anyone about. Because she remembered what it felt like to count pennies and divide $7 between impossible choices. 2 years after Richard Ashford's death, on a cold November evening that felt like an anniversary, Maya stood at a bus stop in the same neighborhood where everything had changed. She wasn't there by accident. She came back sometimes to remember, to ground herself, to make sure that $8 billion hadn't erased the girl who used to walk 4 miles in the dark. As she stood there, lost in thought, she noticed a young boy, maybe 9 years old, kneeling on the pavement. He was gathering something carefully, his small hands working with intense concentration. Maya stepped closer and saw what he was collecting: pennies. 7 or 8 of them, scattered near the curb. The boy counted them twice, then slipped them into his pocket with the care of someone for whom every cent carried weight. Maya felt her throat tighten. She knelt down beside him and he looked up, startled. "Did you drop these?" she asked gently, holding out a few quarters from her own pocket. The boy hesitated, then shook his head. "I found them," he said. His voice was small but not ashamed. "I'm saving up." Maya smiled. "What are you saving for?" He looked at her seriously, as if deciding whether she could be trusted with the truth. "My mom's birthday. I want to get her flowers. She works really hard." The world tilted just slightly, the way it does when the past and present suddenly speak the same language. Maya reached into her bag and pulled out a $20 bill. She held it out to the boy, who stared at it like it might disappear. "This is for your mom's flowers," Maya said, "and for you to keep saving your pennies. Because people who save pennies grow up to be people who remember what matters." The boy took the money with trembling hands, whispered a thank you that barely qualified as sound, and ran off into the evening, his footsteps echoing against the pavement like a heartbeat. Maya stood alone at the bus stop, watching him disappear, and felt the presence of someone who was no longer there. Richard Ashford had been right. Kindness wasn't just a moment. It was a ripple that moved through time, touching lives in ways that could never be measured or predicted. She had been that boy once, counting pennies and hoping they would be enough. Richard had seen her and changed everything. Now she was the one watching, the one with resources beyond imagination, and the responsibility felt both crushing and clarifying. This was what wealth was actually for, not to build higher walls or bigger monuments to ego, but to notice the people counting pennies, to remember that everyone is fighting battles invisible to casual observation, to use power not to elevate yourself but to lift others up. As the bus arrived and Maya stepped aboard, she thought about the letter Richard had left her, the words she had memorized and carried like a compass. Don't let this money change who you are. Let it amplify what you've always been. She was trying. Every day, in every decision, she was trying to be the person Richard had seen in that grainy video, the girl who stopped for pennies and gave up bus rides because kindness was instinctive, not calculated. Some days were harder than others. The business world was brutal, full of people who saw her compassion as weakness and her youth as opportunity. Trevor and Cassandra had never stopped fighting, filing lawsuit after lawsuit, giving interviews that painted her as a villain. The media scrutiny was relentless, every decision analyzed, every mistake magnified. But Maya had learned something in those 2 years that no amount of money could have taught her. The people who matter see you. The ones who don't were never really looking. Richard Ashford had seen her. Her grandmother saw her. The employees she hired and the families she helped saw her. And slowly, gradually, the world was beginning to see her too, not as a scandal or a story, but as proof that kindness, real kindness, still had power. That evening, back in the modest apartment she still shared with her grandmother despite having resources to live anywhere, Maya sat at the kitchen table and counted pennies. Not because she needed to, but because she never wanted to forget what it felt like when she did. Her grandmother watched from the doorway, a small smile on her weathered face. "You're thinking about him again," she said. Maya nodded. "I wish I could have met him, told him thank you." Her grandmother moved to the table and sat down slowly, her joints protesting the movement. "You thank him every day," she said quietly. "Every time you help someone who reminds you of who you used to be. Every time you choose kindness over profit. Every time you remember that people aren't numbers on a spreadsheet. That's the thank you he wanted. Not words. Actions." Maya reached across the table and took her grandmother's hand, this woman who had raised her on Social Security and love, who had taught her that being poor didn't mean being powerless, that dignity wasn't determined by bank accounts. "You taught me that," Maya said. "Before Richard ever saw me, you taught me to stop for pennies and help strangers and treat everyone like they matter." "Grandma taught you to survive," her grandmother replied. "Richard gave you the resources to help others do the same. Together they gave you purpose. That's a gift most people never receive." Later that night, alone in her room, Maya opened the letter she had read 1,000 times. Richard's handwriting was shaky but determined, the words of a man who knew his time was ending but had finally found peace. She read the final paragraph again, the part that always made her cry. "The world will tell you that you don't deserve this. Don't listen." Deserve is a word used by people who think success is about being worthy rather than being useful. You deserve this because you'll use it to remind the world that we're all connected, that kindness isn't weakness, and that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is stop to pick up pennies, not because they need them, but because they understand that everything and everyone has value. Be that reminder, Maya. Be the proof that humanity still exists. And when it gets hard, when people question you and doubt you and try to tear down everything you're building, remember this. I saw you when you didn't know anyone was watching, and what I saw was beautiful. Not because you were perfect, but because you were real. Stay real. The world needs it more than it needs another billionaire. Maya folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the drawer where she kept it, alongside the 8 pennies she had picked up that November night. They sat in a small glass dish, worth almost nothing and meaning everything. Tomorrow she would wake up and continue the work. She would face the critics and the doubters. She would make decisions that prioritized people over profits. She would fail sometimes and succeed others, but through it all, she would remember the lesson that Richard Ashford had spent his final weeks teaching the world. True character reveals itself not in moments of reward, but in moments of choice. Kindness given without expectation creates ripples that change lives in ways that power and money never can. And sometimes, the most important thing we can do is stop, bend down, and pick up the pennies, because in doing so, we acknowledge that everything matters and everyone deserves to be seen. Richard Ashford had given away billions to find that truth. Maya Chen had picked up pennies and proved it existed. And somewhere in the space between those two actions, the world had been reminded of something it had almost forgotten. That humanity, real humanity, isn't bought or sold. It's chosen moment by moment, person by person, one small act of kindness at a time.